I'm Luna. Welcome back to Luna Ơi. This is part 3 in my series on democratic centralism. There are links to parts 1 and 2 in the description, but to recap what we've learned so far. Every group of human beings, including organizations, communities, and governments, has characteristics of democracy as well as characteristics of centralism. Democracy deals with representation of the people in making decisions and directing the group, while centralism refers to unity in thought and action in a group. Democracy and centralism mutually impact and develop one another, and both democracy and centralism can have positive and negative characteristics. Good democracy can help build good centralism by building harmony and productive unity in thought and action among group members. Good centralism can develop democracy by making sure everyone can have a voice and can comfortably place trust in a democratic system. And of course, the opposite is also true. Bad forms of democracy will degrade centralism as unity dissolves, and bad centralism can undermine democracy by putting too much power in too few hands. Marx and Engels define democracy as a system in which the will of the people guides human society through the use of elections and other democratic systems. In contrast, they pointed out that monarchies, feudalism, and bourgeois democracies are not truly democratic at all, since only a small minority wield power and influence in such societies. Marx and Engels saw democracy in all its forms as the primary driving force of humanity, as conflict between democratic demands of the majority contradicted with the tyranny of powerful minority classes, leading to class struggle, which changed and developed human society throughout history. Marx and Engels understood the power of democracy and knew that a working-class revolution would have to be democratic in nature in order to be successful. They laid the philosophical foundation of studying democracy through the lens of dialectical materialism, which paved the way for the development of democratic centralism as we know it today. This brings us to Vladimir Lenin, who was the first to define the philosophical concept of democratic centralism based on the groundwork laid by Marx and Engels in their analysis of democracy. Like Marx and Engels, Lenin was a scientific socialist. This means that he used dialectical materialism as a philosophical framework for fulfilling the mission of the working class in dismantling capitalism and building communism. Scientific socialism upholds democracy as the basis for successfully overthrowing capitalism, and Lenin fleshed out these ideas in both theory and practice. In The Revolutionary Proletariat and the Right of Nations to Self-Determination, written in 1915, Lenin wrote,
"The proletariat cannot be victorious except through democracy, by giving full effect to democracy and by linking with each step of its struggle democratic demands formulated in the most resolute terms."
Lenin, like Marx and Engels, considered the masses of the people to be the makers of history, not any heroic or divine individuals. Under capitalism, just as with previous forms of class society like feudalism, the majority of people have to struggle against a minority ruling class. This struggle between classes, based on a desire for increased and improved democracy, is what has driven human society through every stage of development, from slave societies to feudal societies and on into the current stage of capitalism. Through all the history of class struggle, democracy has always been both a battle slogan and a revolutionary goal for the oppressed classes. What distinguishes capitalism from previous forms of society is the nature of class division. In previous society, power and other characteristics were distributed among a variety of classes, including monarchs, slaves, peasants, nobles, religious leaders, merchants, craftsmen, and so on. Capitalism has reduced the complexity of class structure, so that today the vast majority of humans compose one class, the working class, and a very tiny minority of individuals, the capitalist class, control society. If the working class could manage to overthrow the capitalist class entirely and build a democratic system that represents the will of the working class as a whole, then class struggle will be eliminated forever and humanity will finally have an opportunity to build a society which is truly democratic in nature. The struggle towards achieving that goal can only be achieved through socialism, and socialists must do all we can to put power in the hands of the working class. Lenin put it very simply in an article called "All Power to the Soviets," published in 1917.
Democracy is the rule of the majority.
But it should be pointed out that this rule of the majority doesn't mean oppression of marginalized minorities. All working-class citizens must have a voice and enjoy freedom in order for a society to be called a real democracy. According to Lenin, an organization or society must have the following of 4 characteristics in order to be truly democratic. Equality of all citizens under the law. Political freedom for all citizens. Decisions made by a majority of all citizens. Citizens decide by vote, which is the essence of peaceful, pure democracy. If these 4 criteria are met, then a society can be said to be truly democratic, according to Lenin. Lenin developed this criteria for a true democracy through his revolutionary work in Russia, not just through theoretical hypothesizing, but through practice as a revolutionary leader and organizer. But Lenin also knew that in order for democracy to be used to empower the working class and fight capitalism, it has to take a certain form. Lenin argued that in our current states of development and material conditions, in order to enable the working class to overthrow capitalism and build towards communism, democracy must take the form of a government. So Lenin believed that the task of communist revolutionists was to develop a form of government which would give the working class access to true democracy while still being able to fight against capitalism, imperialism, fascism, and many other threats to the revolution. Lenin called the form of government which the working class would use to fight capitalism and build democracy and power for the working class socialist democracy or proletarian democracy. Lenin famously described the socialist democracy as a dictatorship of the proletariat, but this term is often highly misunderstood. When Lenin talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, he doesn't mean we should have a tyrannical or authoritarian government. He was simply inverting the idea of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, aka the bourgeois democracy. As Marx and Engels had explained, in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class holds all the power. Therefore, a small minority have power over the vast majority of workers. The dictatorship of the proletariat, on the other hand, would put power in the hands of the vast majority of people in society. The working class would have power over the capitalist class, which would help society to begin fulfilling the 4 criteria of a true democracy. Let's compare bourgeois democracy with socialist democracy, one criterion at a time. Equality of all citizens under the law. Under a bourgeois democracy, there is no equality of all citizens under the law. Capitalists can hire expensive lawyers, pay off politicians through lobbying and bribes, and gain all kinds of legal protections through corporate structures. Meanwhile, workers have very few resources to protect themselves, and bourgeois legal institutions offer them fewer protections and benefits. A socialist democracy would truly protect all citizens equally. Every citizen, no matter how poor, should have the same protections and benefits under the law. Political freedom for all citizens. Under a bourgeois democracy, capitalists have far more freedom than the working class. For example, look at freedom of speech. Capitalists have far more of a voice in capitalist society, where they can own entire media institutions and pay to have their propaganda disseminated to millions upon millions of people. Workers have much smaller voices and also lack access to other basic freedoms, like freedom from poverty, preventable disease, and houselessness. A socialist democracy would give an equal voice to everyone, and every member of society would enjoy the same freedoms and benefits with protection from the government. Nobody would have more freedom than anybody else just because they are more wealthy or they own private property. Decisions made by a majority of all citizens. In a bourgeois democracy, the capitalist class controls society. Elections are illusionary in nature. They exist to make workers feel like they have a voice, when in reality the capitalist class controls all aspects of government. The working class may have some token input, but the working class will never be given the power to make any decision, which would jeopardize the power of the capitalist class. A socialist democracy would allow every member of society to have an equal voice in decision-making. Nobody would be excluded from participating in collective decision-making just because they are poor or otherwise marginalized. And the government would truly be in the hands of the majority of society, the proletariat. Citizens decide by vote, which is the essence of peaceful, pure democracy. As I've already said, elections in bourgeois democracies are not real. Decisions aren't really made by popular vote, and representatives don't really represent most people. Capitalists control and rig elections in any number of ways, through spending vast fortunes on political propaganda, through gerrymandering and redistricting, through lobbying, campaign contributions, and other sorts of bribes, through corporate media, and in a million other ways. A socialist democracy would empower workers through more meaningful forms of democracy. It should not be permitted to bribe politicians and political leaders in any way. And every citizen, no matter how poor or marginalized, should have the same access to elections and other democratic structures as everyone else. Once full socialism is established, then a society can then begin transitioning towards a stateless, classless society, which is a dream of all communists. Unfortunately, getting to full socialism is a very long process, one that takes many generations. And so far, no country on earth, not the Soviet Union, not Vietnam, not Cuba, not any other country, has yet achieved full socialism. Lenin knew that it wouldn't be possible to simply throw the socialism switch, especially in Russia, where centuries of rule by the Tsar left the Russian people poor, uneducated, and indoctrinated into reactionary belief and ideology in countless other ways. Building a socialist democracy will be a very difficult task for any nation, and a lot of mistakes will be made along the way, and this was definitely true in Russia. For instance, Lenin knew that the Russian people would need to be educated about democracy. Previous ideas about democracy and self-determination, which were established and disseminated by the capitalist class, would need to be fought against and negated. In Russia, that meant fighting against Tsarist indoctrination. In former colonies like Vietnam, that has meant undoing decades of colonialist propaganda. In capitalist nations, that would mean fighting against ideas of bourgeois democracy, which hold back the working class and hinder the development of socialism. Today, just as in Lenin's time, there are many misperceptions about democracy, just as there are misperceptions about socialism. A lot of people fall for capitalist lies. They believe that bourgeois democracy is good for the people, and they fall for the scam of capitalist-controlled elections, thinking that their votes actually matter in a bourgeois democracy, when, in reality, capitalists actually control the agenda of society behind the scenes. Today, workers in bourgeois democracies are also led to believe that since socialist and former socialist nations like the USSR, Vietnam, and Cuba have never been perfect, and since we have never achieved full socialism, we are complete failures and liars. For instance, a lot of Western leftists argue that Vietnamese communists are lying about wanting to build communism, since we have yet to achieve a stateless, classless society, and because our road towards socialism has been very difficult, with many mistakes and setbacks along the way. The expectation is that we just need to push the socialism button and all the problems will disappear. They don't realize how many problems we face and how many internal and external threats we have that make it very difficult to achieve our dream of building socialism. The problem here is that they treat socialism and democracy as an idea rather than a practical processes of development. Lenin, however, was quite aware that building towards full socialism and create a true socialist democracy would be very difficult. Socialist democracy is a brand new form of government, something that humans have never tried to build before in all of history. And it will take a lot of experimentation and failure to achieve it. We can't simply think of socialism and democracy as utopian ideas, but rather as pragmatic systems which must be built over time through scientific development, which unfortunately includes a lot of trial and error. Building socialist democracy is a process of constantly developing theories and then applying them creatively in real life in our struggle for socialist revolution. Of course, this struggle has to be systemic and organized. There has to be an underlying framework for developing theories and testing them in the real world. We have to have a shared set of values, principles, and characteristics, which we apply as we build towards socialism. And this is exactly what Lenin succeeded in developing in his formulation of the philosophical concept of democratic centralism. Before we dig deeper into Lenin's formulation of democratic centralism, it's important to understand that democratic centralism actually has a few different definitions. First, there is a philosophical concept of democratic centralism. This is simply the recognition that democracy and centralism exist in all human groups, and that democracy and centralism have a dialectical relationship with one another. They mutually impact and develop each other over time. The philosophical conception of democratic centralism is universally applicable to all human groups. You can use this philosophical framework to study and analyze all human groups of all forms and sizes. For instance, you can do a democratic centralist analysis of a family, or of a political party, or of a government, or of the entirety of human civilization. You can study the democratic centralistic properties of not just communist parties, but of fascists, of liberals, of monarchies, of any group of human beings. This is the philosophical foundation from which Lenin formulated as a more specific set of democratic centralist guidelines for political parties. You can think of these democratic centralist guidelines as a philosophical framework to help guide communist political parties toward revolution and then to help communist governments build toward a fully socialist democracies. As we build towards socialist democracy, step by step, we can use these guidelines of democratic centralism to ensure that our democratic forms and our centralist unity mutually develop one another to make our organizations and government as strong as possible. Finally, at the most specific level, there are specific implementations of democratic centralism, which are adopted by specific communist parties, governments, and other organizations all around the world. These can vary pretty widely from place to place and over time. For instance, the democratic centralism of Vietnam has changed significantly over time. At first, way back in the 1920s and 30s, there were various communist parties, unions, and organizations which had different implementations of democratic centralism. Over time, these groups came together to form what we now call the Communist Party of Vietnam. The democratic centralism in Vietnam has also changed significantly from wartime to the subsidizing model era, to the early Đổi mới reforms, to today's socialism-oriented market economy era. Vietnam's democratic centralism today differs significantly from the implementation of democratic centralism in China, Cuba, and other socialist nations. So remember, there are three levels of democratic centralism. The most general philosophical framework of democratic centralism, which can be used to analyze any group of human beings. The democratic centralist guidelines used to build and guide communist parties and societies, and the very specific implementation of democratic centralism used in specific organizations and nations across time and around the world. Okay, with all this in mind, let's take a look at how Lenin began developing the philosophy of democratic centralism in earnest by applying his views on democracy to the material conditions of Russia at that time in order to educate Russian proletariat. One of the biggest problems Lenin knew he had to resolve was the contradiction between democracy and centralism in organizing and developing the Russian working class path to socialism. Lenin believed that many philosophers and leaders were diverging from the basic principles of Marxism. For instance, the German social democrat Edward Bernstein sought to collaborate with the capitalists and believed that socialism could be achieved through reform within a bourgeois democracy. Other popular philosophers who Lenin believed were misleading the working class included Ernst Mach, Karl Kautsky, and Mikhail Bakunin. There were also other large factions such as the Mensheviks who wanted to abandon Marxist proletarian revolution in favor of other divergent philosophies. Lenin wanted to unite the working class through principles of Marxism, but he wanted to achieve this unity through democratic means. In order to achieve this, Lenin sought to build a Marxist political party which could lay the groundwork and help to educate the masses, not in an authoritarian, overly centralized way, but in a way that dialectically developed centralized unity alongside democratic principles. As Lenin wrote in the original version of the article, the immediate task of the Soviet government.
Freedom of discussion, unity of action. This is what we must strive to achieve. Beyond the bounds of unity of action, there must be the broadest and freest discussion and condemnation of all steps, decisions, and tendencies that we regard as harmful. Only through such discussions, resolutions, and protests can the real public opinion of our party be formed. Only on this condition shall we be a real party, always able to express its opinion and finding the right way to convert a definitely formed opinion into the decisions of its next Congress.
Lenin realized that the Russian Revolution held great historical importance. The Russian people were at a crossroads in deciding how they would develop the very first socialist nation on earth, and nobody knew what ideas would work in practice and which would fail. In order to test theory against reality, Russian communists would have to have an organizational structure and a philosophical framework which would offer as much participation from the masses as possible while staying true to the principles of democracy and socialist struggle, first laid out by Marx and Engels, and they would have to do this in a society which still had a powerful bourgeois class and many reactionary tendencies left over from centuries of czarist feudalism. As Lenin said in a speech at the Congress of Economic Councils in 1918,
"We have begun this historical epoch, an epoch in which we are breaking up the discipline of capitalist society in a country which is still bourgeois, and we are proud that all politically conscious workers, absolutely all the toiling peasants, are everywhere helping this destruction. An epoch in which the people voluntarily, on their own initiative, are becoming aware that they must not rely on instructions from above, but on the instructions of their own living experience. This is a task of enormous difficulty, but it is also a thankful one, because only when we solve it in practice shall we have driven the last nail into the coffin of capitalist society which we are burying.
So Lenin believed that the people must guide their own revolution. It was, therefore, the task of the Socialist Party to give power and a voice to the people while educating the working class and raising class consciousness. Thus, the party must have a dialectical relationship with the working class. The party can't simply rule the working class from above, nor can the party simply follow the working class along reactionary lines. The party and the people must develop one another, and the way that they would do this was through the process of democratic centralism. This required a great deal of discipline, theoretical knowledge, and practical experience. If the party and revolutionary leaders become too autocratic and commandist, forcing decisions upon the working class against their will, then democracy will fail and the revolution will collapse, possibly becoming a dictatorship. If, on the other hand, centralized unity and harmony in theory and practice are neglected, then the working class will splinter and fracture into infighting, giving opportunists the opportunity to take advantage of democracy to put the bourgeoisie back in charge of society. There is no specific prescription of democratic centralism which anyone can follow at any given time. You can't just follow a checklist of rules and regulations in applying democratic centralism to the development of human organizations. Instead, revolutionists have to constantly analyze the current situation and make corrections, recognize mistakes and failures, and look for opportunities to foster the mutual development of both democracy and centralized harmony. That said, Lenin did offer some basic principles of democratic centralism, which he presented at the Second Congress of the Communist International. The participants at this Congress wanted to build an international alliance of socialist revolutions, and Lenin proclaimed that
parties joining the Communist International must be built on the principle of democratic centralism.
Lenin's suggested principles thus became the charter of the Second Congress of the Communist International. The actual document is pretty long, so I will just give you a brief summary of each principle of democratic centralism. And I will link to the full document in the description if you want to give it a read. But before we begin, remember, there is a difference between these guidelines for the implementation of democratic centralism for communist parties and the more universal philosophical concept of democratic centralism. So don't get confused. The principles of democratic centralism for communist parties, which Lenin laid out in the Second Congress of the Communist International, are specific guidelines for the application of democratic centralist philosophy to the organization of Communist Party. Okay, with that being said, here are the 10 principles of democratic centralism from the Charter of the Second Congress of the Communist International for communist parties. Number 1, the grassroots party organizations are the organizational core of the party. This is very important. It means that workers must control the party at the ground level. The centralized national body must subservient to local grassroots organizational levels. This gives the structure of a democratic centralist party sort of inverted pyramid shape, where grassroots local organizations are the core basis of power in the party. Number 2, all higher organizations must be elected, are responsible for reporting on their work, and can be dismissed. This one is pretty obvious. No high position should simply be appointed or selected arbitrarily. All positions and organizational structures should be elected, with the ultimate power of voting held at the local grassroots level. Number 3, the party is an organization of independent workers who are educated on social democracy. The party is not a special class of people. It should be composed of workers, and these workers must be educated in the principles of scientific socialism, including democratic centralism. Number 4, the autonomy of all communist parties must be recognized. No nation's communist party should have the power over the communist party of any other nation. The communist parties should be autonomous and allowed to build socialism based on their own material conditions. Number 5, all party members must eliminate the competition for territory between different parties and overcome the fear of other parties. This is especially important in the earliest stages of revolution, when various communist parties will no doubt exist in different regions and cities. These parties must find ways to work together and, ideally, come together in unity over time while combating reactionary and opportunistic parties and individuals which seek to restore power of the capitalist class. Number 6, there must be organizational unity, and at the same time, there should be purely ideological struggles between different social democratic ideological trends within a party. There can't just be one single ideological prescription which all members must follow blindly. Members of the party must be allowed to hold ideological differences and freely voice their opinions and concerns in party meetings and when solving problems, which must be balanced with the goal of developing centralized unity and harmony in ideology and action over time, and eliminating bourgeois influence and sabotage within the party. Number 7. Clearly identify the causes of contradictions among ideological change within the party, because it is a necessary condition for a healthy development of the party in order to educate the working class and avoid errors in policies. Just as it is important for different ideological positions to be held, it is also important for the party to have an introspective awareness of these different tendencies. We can't just pretend ideological differences don't exist. Instead, we have to work tirelessly to understand the nature of ideological differences in order to negate internal contradictions as smoothly and harmoniously as possible. Number 8. In ideological activities, it is necessary to point out which issues are in agreement, which issues are still in disagreement, and to what extent. The party must get rid of the old habits, such as to accuse other people without sincerely and thoroughly analyzing dissenting opinions. It is easy for members of the party to opportunistically attack one another and to arrange themselves into factions. Some members may try to build their own personal power base and sow division within the party for their own personal gain. This must be strictly prohibited, and disagreement must be worked out in good faith with the ultimate goal of building unity and harmony in the party. Number 9. Provide party members with sufficient documents on party activities so that party members can independently study the disagreement in the process of party decision-making. This is pretty simple and pretty important. Party activity must be documented, and documentation must be disseminated to all members so that everyone can know what's going on at all times. Number 10. The party must discuss as widely and openly as possible all the issues and resolutions. Party members must have a complete self-conscious and critical attitude towards the party's resolutions. The party must create conditions for party members and workers' organizations to understand and to express their agreement or disagreement with the party's situations and resolutions via discussion, newspaper, group meetings, and etc. Nobody should simply blindly follow the party. The party's action and decisions should be constantly criticized by the membership to identify mistakes, clarify positions, and maintain an efficient path towards socialism. Okay, so this should give you an idea of the guidelines Lenin suggested for the implementation of democratic centralism for communist parties. Lenin based his principles on the philosophical foundation of democratic centralist philosophy with the goal of maintaining the freedom to discuss and disagree within the party while simultaneously developing unity in action and ideology over time. In a well-unified party, the ideological struggle must not be used to divide the party, nor to destroy the unity and action of the proletariat. Instead, disagreement and ideological struggle should be used to unify the party and the working class and to develop democratic structures. This is very important to understand because disagreement and debate and internal divisions can easily be used by opportunists to build their own personal power, to undermine the proletarian mission of building communism, and to develop splinter groups which seek to disrupt and sabotage the working class from within. You see this a lot with Western leftists who use debate tactics and sophistry to sow chaos and division within the working class. The goal of democratic centralism is to elevate disagreement and debate so that it positively develops the party and the working class as a whole. It's entirely possible for disagreement and criticism to be constructive. After all, we need to be able to identify flaws, mistakes, and weaknesses so that we can fix them and make our revolution stronger. This is why Lenin believed that disagreement and freedom of dissent within the party is so important. But if disagreement and criticism are used cynically and opportunistically, then they can quickly become destructive. So the goal of socialists must be to use democratic centralist strategies and tactics to use disagreement, dissent, and critique to the betterment of the revolution, while restricting people from using disagreement and dissent as weapons against the working class. In Lenin's time, there were many people who were opposed to the principle of democratic centralism. Some of these critics claimed that Lenin was too anarchistic and not centralistic enough. For example, in 1917, the bourgeois provisional government of Russia was against the seizure of land by the peasantry. The provisional government wanted land distribution to be worked out through compromise between peasants and landlords. Lenin strictly opposed this and supported the seizure of land and redistribution directly to peasants without compromising with landlords. Lenin wanted power in the hands of local peasants, and he believed that this would be the best basis for a national government which could deal with issues of land and justice for peasants. Other critics claimed the opposite, that democratic centralism was an authoritarian philosophy which sacrificed democracy at the expense of centralism. One such faction which accused democratic centralism of being too authoritarian were the Federalists. The Federalists call for a system which is purely democratic without centralism. Basically, the Federalists call for quote-unquote decentralized system for decision-making, in which participants could voluntarily submit to the system, but they could leave at any time. The idea is that everyone should be able to enter or leave the system at any time and for any reason, and that centralism could thus be eliminated altogether, leaving a pure democracy. The mistake here is pretending that centralism is somehow inherently bad or even something that can and should be avoided altogether. The fact is, centralism is present in all human groups. Even federalist systems have to have some degree of centralism, or they simply fall apart into countless splinter groups with no cohesion whatsoever. So, opposition to the very concept of centralism is really just individualism. Democratic centralism takes the more realistic and practical position that centralism will always exist in any group of human beings, and that we should therefore try to understand the role of centralism plays in society and how centralism interacts with democracy. As revolutionary movements develop and advance, the dynamics between democracy and centralism will constantly be changing, and it's the job of every revolutionary to study the relationship between democracy and centralism and to try to constantly develop and improve both democracy and centralism in the road towards socialism. To fight against false accusations of authoritarianism, Lenin wrote in his first draft of the immediate tasks of the Soviet government.
Those who oppose democratic centralism always suggest autonomism or federalism as opposing alternatives, and consider those to be a solution in opposition to the instability of democratic centralism. But in fact, democratic centralism does not eliminate nor exclude anarchist autonomism. On the contrary, it includes the necessity to have autonomism internally. The same is true of federalism. Democratic centralism could be applied within federalism, and federalism does not inherently oppose democratic centralism. In a true democratic regime, federalism is just a transitional step towards true democratic centralism. The federal system does not in the slightest contradict with democratic centralism. In a true democratic regime, federalism is often only a transitional step towards genuine democratic centralism. There's no bigger mistake than mixing democratic centralism with bureaucracy and dogmatism. Now, our immediate task is to practice democratic centralism in our economy and to uphold and allow local groups to develop their own ideas and express their own ideas as we move toward a common goal.
Surprisingly, Lenin was not opposed to most of the basic principles of federalism, especially in the early stages of revolution. The principles of democratic centralism uphold autonomy and grassroots organization as vitally important. So Lenin did not really disagree with the Federalists as much as the Federalists said he did. However, one way in which Lenin strongly disagreed with Federalists was their lack of adherence to socialism. Lenin believed that the only reason socialists should have a revolution and build a democratic centralist government to begin with was to build towards socialism and socialist democracy. The Federalists, on the other hand, did not believe in any one unifying goal or vision for society, and Lenin believed that this gave opportunists and capitalist agents the opportunity to disrupt the revolution and seize back control of society. Since centralism was discounted and disregarded and even denied by the Federalists, there was no explicit ambition to build towards harmony, unity, and centralization of thought and action. Without a centralized goal for eliminating capitalism and building socialism, the working class was splintered into countless factions. Democratic centralism is simply a process of uniting disparate factions together under the common cause of overthrowing capitalism and building towards a socialist democracy, in which every single person has a voice within a self-determining government. In the early stages of revolution, principles of democratic centralism must be used to guide parties towards growth and acceptance among the working class. Disparate parties must then find ways to work together and merge together over time until enough cohesion and power is developed to seize control over the state, from the capitalist class to institute the dictatorship of the proletariat. Once the dictatorship of the proletariat has been established, the principle of democratic centralism must then be applied both in the organization and operation of the whole socialist government, the entire political system, and also in the management of the nation's socio-economic processes, with the ambition of building towards socialist democracy. I should note that no nation on earth has yet made it all the way to socialist democracy. The Soviet Union never fulfilled all of Lenin's criteria of democracy. Vietnam today is still in the process of building towards socialist democracy, and we have a long way to go. It's actually very difficult to build a socialist democracy because of all the threats and challenges faced by the capitalist imperialist world. I have a few videos on many of the challenges and setbacks Vietnam has faced, but suffice to say, it's really hard to build a fully functioning socialist democracy. If it were easy, I'm sure someone would have done it by now, and if you think it's easy, then I hope you will stand up and lead your people to full socialism and show us how it's done. Anyway, even if you disagree with the principles of socialism, communism, Marxism, Leninism, and so on, you can still use the philosophical framework of democratic centralism to analyze governments, political parties, and other groups of human beings. That's because democratic centralism is, at the core, simply the recognition that democracy and centralism exist in all groups of human beings, and that democracy and centralism mutually impact and develop one another over time. As Lenin said, democratic centralism is not a principle that exists exclusively for communists. It is, in fact, a recognition of basic fact about reality which any group could apply in developing their goals. Okay, so now you have a basic understanding of Lenin's formulation of democratic centralism and the application of democratic centralism for communist parties. In our next episode, we will take a look at how democratic centralism has been applied specifically here in Vietnam. I will tell you about the history of democratic centralism and how it is applied in our Communist Party, in our government, and in other organizations such as Labor Union, Women's Union, and the National Front, as well as some mistakes that we've made and challenges we face today in developing democracy and centralized harmony as we build towards a socialist democracy. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye!
The original Italian and German variations of fascism was a political phenomenon that made a revolutionary appeal without making a revolution. It promised to solve the ills of the many while in fact protecting the special interests of the few with violence and terror. It propagated a new political consciousness, a new order, a new nation to serve the same old capitalist system. So this is real history.